a shadow in the heart of the Holy City. Imagine May of 1945. The last volleys of the Second World War, which claimed the lives of tens of millions of people, have finally fallen silent. In Europe, lying in ruins, an unfamiliar, precarious quiet has settled. It seemed that hell had ended. The Allies are celebrating victory, and in Nuremberg, a grand trial of the main Nazi criminals is beginning. The whole world is looking at this justice with relief and hope, believing that evil will be named evil and will receive its deserved punishment. But behind these loud trials, under the bright spotlight of history, something else was happening. Something quiet, dark, and therefore even more terrifying. While some executioners sat on the defendant's bench, others disappeared, without a trace. Thousands of them, from the most odious architects of the Holocaust to the rank-and-file executioners, whose hands were elbow-deep in blood, seemed to vanish into thin air. They evaded retribution through secret, well-established channels, like rats fleeing a sinking ship. English intelligence officers gave this phenomenon a fitting and cynical name, the Ratlines. And the most shocking, the most inconvenient thing, which was preferred to be kept silent about for a long time, is that the central hub, the heart of this Ratline, became the Vatican. Yes, that very spiritual and administrative center of world Catholicism, the city-state that embodies the highest moral values and holiness for hundreds of millions of people. How did it happen that the heart of the Christian world extended a hand to those who organized one of the most monstrous genocides in human history? Why did the Church, which should have been on the side of the victims, effectively side with the executioners? To understand this, we must immerse ourselves not only in the chronicles of the escapes, but also in the geopolitical chaos of that time, in the cold calculations of the nascent Cold War, and in the personal tragedies of those who were never destined to see justice. This is a story not only about escape. It is a story about betrayal, about cynicism, about how higher interests, or what is passed off as them, overshadow the very idea of good and evil. It is a story that forces you to rethink everything you know about the post-war world order. Ready? Then let's begin our journey through the dark labyrinths of history. A world at a crossroads. The birth of a new fear. To truly understand the Vatican's motives, you need to mentally transport yourself to that unique and extremely unstable moment in history. May of 1945 is not just the end of the war. It is a point of bifurcation, a moment when the old world collapsed and a new one had not yet been born. Economic and political background. Europe in 1945. The picture was truly apocalyptic. The economies of most European countries lay in ruins. Industry was destroyed, infrastructure was obliterated, fields were scorched. Tens of millions of people became refugees, displaced persons. They wandered the roads of Europe in search of homes that no longer existed or in search of some kind of shelter. The financial system wasn't working. Money was worthless. Barter became the main currency. Cigarettes, canned food, chocolate. The black market flourished, and with it, banditry and despair. In these conditions, it was incredibly difficult to separate real refugees, victims of the war, from those who, under their guise, were trying to hide their Nazi past. And against the backdrop of this universal chaos and destruction, a new, even more global conflict was emerging: the Cold War. The allies of the anti-Hitler coalition, the USA, Great Britain, and the USSR, were still smiling at each other in joint photographs. But in the halls of power, calculations for the future confrontation were already in full swing. The Vatican and its existential enemy. And what about the Vatican? What were its thoughts and fears? At the head of the Holy See at that time was Pope Pius XII, Eugenio Pacelli. This was a complex and in many ways tragic figure. A diplomat to the core, a man who saw in communist ideology in the Soviet Union not just a political opponent, but an existential, metaphysical threat to the entire Christian civilization. And his fear was not unfounded. The Church in the USSR had been subjected to the most severe persecution since the Bolsheviks came to power. Priests were shot, churches were desecrated and destroyed, Faith itself was declared the opium of the people. For Pius XII and the entire Vatican apparatus, godless Bolshevism was an absolute evil that sought to destroy the very soul of Europe. And here is the paradox. Yesterday's enemy, Nazism, was defeated, but in its place arose a new, seemingly even more terrible and large-scale enemy. And in this new coordinate system, former Nazis, especially from intelligence, the SS and anti-partisan units, suddenly began to be perceived not as criminals, but as a valuable resource. What could they offer? Rabid, fanatical anti-communism. These people hated communists with all their hearts, and they could be used as a shock force in the ideological struggle. Priceless intelligence. Employees of the Abwehr and SD knew about the structure of the Soviet intelligence services, their methods of work, and their agent network in Eastern Europe. This information was worth its weight in gold to Western intelligence agencies. Combat experience. Experience in conducting sabotage warfare, anti-partisan operations, and psychological manipulation. Thus, a monstrous from a moral point of view, but absolutely pragmatic from the point of view of geopolitics, concept was born: the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Both the Vatican and the Western intelligence agencies, the newly emerging CIA and British MI6, looked at the fleeing Nazis through this prism. Their crimes against humanity seemed to be erased, becoming unfortunate costs in the light of the coming holy war with communism. It was this collective fear, this justification of a higher purpose, that became the breeding ground in which the Ratlines sprouted and flourished. The Vatican provided for this operation not so much logistics, although that too, as something more important: moral cover. If the Church, even silently, approves of these actions, then they cannot be completely sinful, right? There must be some higher meaning in this. The architects of the Ratline, priests in cassocks sheltering executioners. The system would not have worked so effectively without several key figures, fanatically devoted to their cause. These people did not act alone. They relied on a powerful network within the church hierarchy. Let's get to know them better. Alois Hudel, the bishop for misguided sheep. The rector of the German-speaking seminary at the Church of Santa Maria dell'Anima in Rome, the Austrian bishop Alois Hudel was, without exaggeration, the ideological inspirer and one of the main organizers of the escapes. An open sympathizer of the Nazi regime, he saw Hitler as a defender of Europe from the Bolshevik plague. After the war, Hudel developed his own, very specific theology of salvation. He considered the fleeing SS men misguided sons of the Church, persecuted by the new, often pro-Soviet authorities. In his memoirs, he would later write shocking words: "I thank God that He allowed me to visit and comfort many victims in their prisons and camps and help them escape with false documents." His apartment in Rome and the monasteries under his control became the first and most reliable transit point for the fugitives. Here they received not only shelter and food, but also initial psychological support. Hudel convinced them that they were not criminals, but victims, fighters for a just cause who had suffered from losing the war. But the main thing they received from Hudel was false documents. And here we come to the most cynical element of the entire system. For the legalization of fugitives, the charitable organization of the Vatican, the Pontifical Commission of Assistance, Pontificia Commission di Assistenza, was used. This commission, created to help real refugees, victims of the war, issued hundreds and thousands of certificates, identification documents. Having received such a legitimate paper from a priest, the Nazi could, with a clear conscience, apply to the International Committee of the Red Cross. The Red Cross, trusting the Vatican's seal, issued them genuine refugee passports. And so, it was no longer Obersturmführer SS Klaus Müller, but the harmless refugee Peter Schulz, who received a visa and could calmly sail to Argentina. The mechanism was perfected and shocking in its hypocrisy. A charitable structure of the church helped executioners deceive another charitable structure. Krunoslav Draganovic, the monk broker of Eustace. If Hudel was the ideologist, Then the Croatian Franciscan priest Krunoslav Draganovic became the brilliant operations manager of the Ratlines. A convinced Croatian nationalist, his main goal was to save members of the Ustase regime, the fascist, ultranationalist movement that ruled Croatia under the protectorate of the Nazis. The Ustase regime under the leadership of Poglavnik Ante Pavelić was known for its incredible, bestial cruelty towards Serbs, Jews, and Roma. They created their own concentration camps, the most terrible of which was Jasenovac, where killings were often carried out with cold weapons, knives and hammers. The scale of the atrocities was horrifying. Draganovic, ironically called the Vatican monastery of the Ustase, created not just a network, but a real conveyor belt for the evacuation of these criminals. His network was so effective that he personally oversaw the escape of Pavelić himself. The well-oiled route of the Ratlines. Start. Austria, camp for displaced persons. Among the thousands of real refugees, former Ustase and SS men were lost. Crossing the Alps, with the help of guides and smugglers, they made their way through the mountains to Italy. Rome, the city of refuge. Here they were received in monasteries and churches connected with Feudal and Draganovic. Their appearance was changed, they were given false documents, and prepared for a long journey. Genoa, the gateway to a new life. From the Roman shelters, the fugitives went to the port of Genoa. Here, often with the help of sympathetic captains or through front transport companies, they boarded ships sailing to Buenos Aires, Argentina, Montevideo, Uruguay, or the Middle East, in particular to Syria and Egypt. Argentina, under Juan Perón, became a particularly welcoming haven. Perón's regime, sympathetic to fascist ideas, consciously attracted high-class German specialists and military men to the country, turning a blind eye to their past. It was a state policy intertwined with the Vatican's networks. The passengers of the Ratlines, the faces that escaped justice. Who was saved by this system? Not faceless Nazis, but specific people whose names are forever written in history in bloody letters. Thanks to the Ratlines, dozens, if not hundreds, of the most wanted war criminals began their new lives, under different names, far from the gallows. Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust. This man was not a soldier, not an executioner in the direct sense. He was a bureaucrat, a clerk of death. His job was to organize the final solution to the Jewish question, coordinating the deportation of millions of Jews to death camps. His pedantry and efficiency made the Holocaust so effective and terrible. After the war, Eichmann, using the network of Draganovic and Feudal, hid in Argentina. He lived under the name Ricardo Clement, worked at a Mercedes-Benz plant. For many years, he felt completely safe until Israeli intelligence agency Mossad tracked him down. In 1960, he was kidnapped in a suburb of Buenos Aires and secretly taken to Israel, where one of the most famous trials of the century took place, ending with his execution. But for a full 15 years, he was free thanks to the Vatican. Joseph Mengele, the angel of death from Auschwitz, perhaps the most monstrous, in terms of the inhumanity of his actions, passenger of the Ratlines. A doctor at the Auschwitz concentration camp, Mengele conducted inhuman experiments on prisoners, especially on twins. His research had no scientific value and was merely a cover for sadistic tendencies. He also fled to Argentina, lived for some time in Buenos Aires, then moved to Paraguay, and later to Brazil. Unlike Eichmann, he was never caught. He drowned in the Atlantic Ocean in 1979 while swimming at a beach. Until his death, he was in hiding, but he was often visited by former Nazi comrades and local residents sympathetic to him. The network worked even after his escape, providing him with support. Franz Stangl and Walter Roth, the engineers of hell. Stangl was the commandant of the Treblinka and Sobibor death camps. He personally oversaw the murder of hundreds of thousands of people. He fled via Syria to Brazil, where he was only arrested in 1967. He died in prison. Walter Roth, the inventor of the gas vans, mobile gas chambers in which tens of thousands of people were killed. He fled to Chile, where he lived under his own name. Chile refused to extradite him for a long time. He died in 1984 never having been punished. I am specifically listing these names and their fates so that you don't just see faceless criminals. These were specific people who committed specific atrocities, and each of them, receiving a fake passport from the hands of Catholic priests, received not just a ticket to freedom. He received silent forgiveness. He received an indulgence from the church itself. And herein lies the main horror of this entire story: the silence of the Vatican, archives, and the unseemly truth. For decades, the official Vatican categorically denied its involvement in the Ratlines. The standard excuse was it was the initiative of individual priests acting in a private capacity. Bishop Hudel was declared a lone wolf, whose actions were contrary to the policy of the Holy See. But the scale of the network, its efficiency, and the duration of its operation, it was actively operating until the early 50s, leave no doubt. This was not random charity, but a well-oiled system, which, if not directly ordered from the very top, was certainly known and condoned at the highest levels of the Curia. The main stumbling block was always the archives. Historians and journalists demanded for decades that the archives of the pontificate of Pius XII be opened. And for a long time, the Vatican refused, citing their confidentiality and the need for cataloging. The breakthrough: the opening of the archives in the year 2020. In the year 2020, by personal order of the current Pope Francis, these archives were finally opened. This was a historic event. Dozens of historians from all over the world rushed to the Vatican to finally get to the truth. And what did they find? There was, of course, no direct order to save the Nazis. But they found something more important: a system of silent approval and condoning. What the archives contain: files of the Vatican Information Service, tens of thousands of requests for help. Among the requests to search for the missing and help real refugees, historians have found hundreds of petitions from bishops, priests, and influential laymen asking for help for specific individuals accused of war crimes. These requests were not thrown into the trash, but were considered, and correspondence was conducted on them. Correspondence of the Secretary of State. This is diplomatic correspondence with nuncios, Vatican ambassadors, around the world. It contains dispatches about repatriation negotiations, discussions of the problem of war criminals, as well as confidential records of interaction with organizations such as the Red Cross regarding the issuance of documents. It becomes clear that the Vatican, at a diplomatic level, created favorable conditions for the network's work. The personal archive of Pope Pius XII. These are the most candid documents. They shed light on his true motives. They show a man obsessively focused on the threat of communism. His silence, his non-interference in the activities of Hudel and Draganovic, the absence of any prohibitions or condemnations. All this points to one thing: he knew and approved. His inaction was a form of action. The archives confirm the Vatican was not a blind tool. It was the central hub, the think tank that created the moral and organizational climate that allowed thousands of former Nazis to be transported to safe shores, leaving their victims without justice. The price of geopolitics, an eternal stain. So what do we have in the end? The Vatican, guided by the idea of fighting the greater evil, communism, consciously made a deal with its conscience. It extended a hand to the lesser evil, Nazism, thereby blurring the very boundary between good and evil. Personally, for me, there is and cannot be any justification for this. No higher geopolitical goal can justify helping executioners, betraying the memory of their victims. The Ratlines is not just a dark page in the history of the Catholic Church. It is an eternal, indelible stain on its conscience. It is, by the way, not the only one, but one of the darkest. It shows that even the most sacred institutions, faced with a choice between morality and pragmatism, can choose the latter. This story is a harsh lesson for all of us. It makes us think about what we ourselves are ready to turn a blind eye to for the sake of higher interests. And where is that line, crossing which we ourselves become accomplices to a crime? The truth has come out. It always finds a way, and now it is with us. So our investigation has come to an end. I'm sure it touched a nerve. This story cannot leave anyone indifferent. What do you think about this? Does a higher goal justify such means? Should the Vatican bear responsibility for what was done, even if only moral? Write your thoughts, angry responses, questions in the comments. Let's discuss it together, because such topics cannot be hushed up. Be sure to subscribe to the channel. We have many more shocking historical mysteries ahead that they won't tell you about in school. Like this video if you found it valuable, and share it with your friends. Let as many people as possible learn the truth. See you soon in new investigations.